My name is Jamshed Mavalwala, and I have with me today Mairuth Haas, who is a writer and a broadcaster. Mairuth, how do you feel about being black?
I feel great. I feel like being black on several levels, it's basically a great can't be put on. You know, it's the in thing to be, it's fun, it's a weapon, and occasionally it's something that creates a great deal of sorrow and brings tears. It's an enigma. I grew up conscious of being black only when people pegged me with blackness, with being a Negro or something different. For example, I was me, and I was all the things I was, and all the things the children in the neighborhood were. You know, you were poor, and or your nose ran, or you know, you didn't behave, this sort of thing. And then suddenly there was something kind of very different about you, which they called being black or Negro at schools, and they had a little tag they put on you, so that the question isn't what is being black to me. The question is, what is being black to you and every other Canadian who kind of has this mystique about what a black person is and expects you to live up to it? And then, of course, you're curious, you know, what's wrong with being black, you know, that I can't live here, there, or somewhere else, or can't get a job, or what's great about being black that I should have rhythm when, in fact, I might not, you know,
Yes.
Or when you become you know, when you start to grow, the mystique of sex and race, you know,
Yes.
it's hilarious, and then you have to live up to it. You have to live up to the image whether you feel it or not. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is a cultural one. It's like, you know, I grew up in Quebec, and my mother was the kind of woman who loved festivals and holidays. And all of our friends came from kind of various parts of Europe and Asia, and whenever they had a festival, she would take us because this was something that enriched us. She told us folk tales. And I wanted to have a heritage too. So she would tell us about our African heritage. And this was rich. This was part of being black. And this was, you know, this was wonderful because I really was something and somebody.
Do you remember a particular age or a particular time when you first recognized the label as being significant?
Yeah, but I think first I recognized the label as being significant in a very negative factor when we were quite young and we'd hear, at the YWCA, you know, we were very young girls, and the black kids couldn't swim in the pool. And I'm not that old, so that wasn't so long ago. They wouldn't let the colored kids swim in the pool at the YWCA. And we used to try and figure out, well, why could we play in the gymnasium? Why could we have clubs there? Why were we invited there? And we couldn't swim in the pool.
Were you ever in a situation where it was obvious that your skin color mattered, but then after talking to you or something, somebody turned to you and said, you're different? They were willing to accept you as a person,
Yeah.
but they were not willing to destroy the lesson that
The myths. They
myth.
wanted to believe that to be black was inferior.
Yes, but
And-
that you,
but I
since
was different.
you were not playing the role or whatever, you were different. They meant it as a
You hear
compliment.
it constantly, but it's such a joke because I am a product of my environment, my school, my mother and father's expectations, their income level. If you couldn't see me on television, you know, if you would read about me or know about me, and you couldn't tell really who I was, except in my private life and my loves and my drives. Being black is what feeds me. You know, I'd love to be whatever it is that is still great and rich and full of culture, and gives you a spark that you can feed from. If I'm pegged black, then that's because perhaps I am brown, and most people think the sum total of all these things
Yes.
is black. And it's in vogue now. It's a thing to be. I happen to know that I have African ancestry, and you know, it's so exciting. But I think that I'm the kind of person I am because of all these factors, not the negative things, but because when you have a chance to be liberated, because I'm like lots of other people, this freedom allows you to creatively, for example, to do things. It's fed from something. If it's fed from prejudice, if it's like the children, the mothers now who tell their children to be careful of little black children, or who feed them myths, or you've got to be afraid of Chinese, or you've got to do this, that, and the other, those people are crippling their children like they're breaking their legs, because if these children are going to grow up and do things, where are the bridges still to be built, in Africa? Where are the engineers going to make their names? Where are you going to be able to go where you're fed and you write and you really become a full person? Where all these people are now living as one. In these other lands, we've exhausted kind of just a European narrowness. And so parents who bring their children up with these myths are crippling them.
Why, this, it's sort of universal. The Japanese have stories about the Chinese, and the Chinese
and the Africans have stories about other nations within Africa. I mean, if you're West Coast.
Why do you think that people feel compelled to instill fear? Because I feel that that's the overriding emotion that ends up...
At the risk of not being rational, I think some of the fear... I don't like to call it fear. I think some of the myths, some of the things which people have, I don't mind people having their own neurotic way of doing things.
Rationale.
But where I draw the line is, don't get on my back to do it. If you want to be neurotic, stay in your own backyard and be neurotic. Don't climb on my back and don't use me for your neuroses. So that if I want to believe some of the myths, and throughout history, the Sumerians have been afraid of people, right? These are kind of myths and tales and kind of self-protective things people have built up. But when these become, when you need to climb on someone's back, when you need to defeat someone else, when you need to be warlike, when you need to belittle or demean another group of people, this is where I draw the line, and this is where it's crippling, and this is where it's vicious. But I really think, I'd hate to see a garden of all white roses, I think that the infinite variety of all peoples is what is exciting.
You said earlier that even among American blacks, that there are differences and levels and sort of groups within the inner groups, within the outer group. Are these very strong?
Well, they're strong if you study them, or if your antenna are up. And see, we are inclined to be told in our school textbooks that the blacks arrived in America on ships, plonk, they set down. No one ever tells us that there were many nations in Africa, and they varied from the 7-foot-high Watusis to the little Bantus. They varied from, very few of the Akans, really got into slavery because they were the Egyptians.
They were selling them.
They were selling them, right. But there were nations, and they were just as different. I mean, the Yoruba was completely different to another one of the Gas. So that when they arrived here, they weren't all one people, but white people saw their color and said, Africans, that's it. Not only that, of course, they were broken up.
Yeah, you hear this all the time.
Yeah.
I hear Chinese all look alike, the Japanese all look alike, but
and
the
to
Japanese...
the Africans, all the Europeans look alike, except maybe some are tall and blonde. It's, there were as many nations in Africa as there are nations in Europe. And that's what I mean by crippling people. When people refuse to investigate this infinite variety of peoples and judge each person or family according to its own achievement and level, they're cheating themselves.
The black in America, though, when he identifies himself in a subculture,
yes,
does he identify himself in a do you think he identifies himself in a subculture because he's conscious of a differential African ancestry, or are these social, economic factors, shades of skin color, like in the Indian caste system?
There's something unbelievable happening, When, you hate to say these things because for every generality, there's a there's the opposite. But
Don't worry.
okay, I could be as bigoted as I choose, right?
Sure.
All right. When we go back to Africa now, when I went back with a large group of American blacks, very bright, graduate students. We were studying, went back to Ghana, to the Institute of African Studies, right? Now, one of the things that broke your heart is the hunger of the American black to identify with the African black. And the African black does welcome him. He knows he's a brother. But the American black, for the most part, are so American, that they couldn't really identify that tightly. I don't think they even knew that the American culture is so ingrained in them, the expectations, everything has ground them into a kind of a person that even if they wanted to go home, back to Africa, they have to work so hard to fit in again because Africa has changed since they left, they have changed since they left, and the cultural patterns, the school systems, if nothing else, and the expectations have been different, have been shaped differently. The Ghana, for example, and Nigeria have been shaped by the British, right or wrongly. It exists right now. And there is a clash. And when you go into the slave castles, into the forts, and you're cold, you're cold and you're frightened, and 300 years drops away, or 200 years, or 150 years drops away because suddenly you're in these slave castles, and you're back in Africa, and if you can only break through that last moment when you're cold and you're chilled, you can go home, and you suddenly know, yes, this is my home, this is where I stemmed from. So there is a sense of belonging to a people's. You come out again, and maybe for 2 or 3 days you're disoriented, and then all of your environment, all your growing up takes over, and you become kind of American again. So that it's difficult because America has bred a black man and made him what he is. So they're both in this pot together. They have bred, if they want to call it a monster, it's a monster. But they have been a monster. It's like I was in the South. And you've got to stay in that ditch to keep the black man in the ditch. You've got to stay in that gutter to keep the black man in the gutter. So they were all in the gutter.
One always hears this phrase every now and then. Go back where you came from.
But you can't.
But if everybody did, there would be chaos. Yeah. Economic, political, social, psychological, and on and on and on.
Yeah, you've left home, so come and visit or send money, but stay there. I don't know, it's...
How do your children feel? They're growing up in a different world.
Well, they're growing up in the world I grew up in.
You think it's still the same?
Oh, it's different because the world is different, but my daughter, for example, speaks English, French, German, interchanges it. And her extra language is Italian because she likes it. I think she grew up in Canada. She went to school in Europe for a couple, and she's back here at university. She's very African. She's a throwback to my ancestors. And
very African in looks?
Oh, she's
or in
so
character?
African in looks. She's like a piece of Nubian sculpture. She's very beautiful. She's tall and she's black and she's elegant. And when I see her, I hold my tummy and I stand straight and I think, I believe in ancestor worship now because she's so beautiful. Yes, but
You're
again,
gonna have trouble when your daughter sees this program.
Yeah, but it's the thing you said. She's so many things. She's so many people. She'll never stop being African because she looks it, so she'll be curious as to what these things are. But that's not just African. That's blackness, And it may have had its root, as far as I know and we know, in a certain part of Africa. But who fed that part of Africa? What were the other roots that made it? You look at Nefertiti, Yes. And people keep telling us in history she's Egyptian, and according to laws, Egyptians are now white. Or I don't know what they're supposed to... it depends on the politics, right?
Yes.
Nefertiti and Jennifer are like this. And half the blacks I know from Africa look like sculpture or Greeks. Yeah. And then they're classified, like South Africa, they keep reclassifying them. They make the Japanese white because it's convenient, because they're a trade factor.
The Japanese are also white in Australia.
Yeah, but if the Japanese had any sense, they'd say, look, I'm who I am. You know, I want to be who I am with a brown face. If I had red hair, it'd be marvelous. A little boy with red hair and freckles, I want him to be who he is with red hair and freckles. I want to be who I am with a brown skin or a black skin and black hair, unless I dyed another color.
Do you think this is ever going to come about?
I think it's here. I think that, McLuhan, when he says the rearview mirror, that most people are using it, he's very right. We only look at things through the mirror on the side of our car as it's passed us by. I think that's it. People think the myth of race is intact, but in fact we're going into a completely different world. And maybe my children, and these other children, are products of that world. They're rich because there's so many people. They say, oh, I have an ounce of Jewish blood, or I have an ounce of this blood. That's blood, and that's where it's at. And the only ones who are the dinosaurs are the ones who still believe this myth of the restricted race according to someone's book in 1884.
So you really think that the coming generation will look at people as individuals rather than as
If they
people?
don't, they might as well put blinders on. I mean, they are individuals. Am I like every other black person you saw?
Good Lord, no.
And I don't want to be like
wish,
any other white person you saw. I don't want to be like any other yellow person you saw. But I want to be a
Yes.
bit of all these people.
Yeah.
I-
Do you think we should do IQ tests on groups of people? Particularly the IQ
didn't know you were
testing.
going to ask me that because
IQ tests bother me very much because of the enormous... This is what I think happens in science a great deal, or at the university. We study things.
Mm-hmm.
We get certain results. We publish those results.
Mm-hmm.
And those results are read not by people who understand the problems of
Mm-hmm.
setting up the experiment, the difficulties of designing IQ tests, and etc., do not appreciate the niceties of a particular test versus another, and etc., but who see the end result. They read the conclusions, or they read the criticism of the paper, and either blow their stack or gleefully rush to the state legislature and pass a new law on something.
Yes, but the IQ tests often, now if we're speaking of the IQ tests done in neighborhoods which they now describe as culturally deprived or some such thing. They haven't got a new name for it. They don't like using negatives like deprived. It's culturally something. Are judged according to white, middle-class, mythical standards. So when they're judging the little ghetto children and giving them an IQ and then turning around and judging it, they're judging it by a standard and a set of values or mores which these kids simply do not have and may never need. Right?
Yes.
That's stupid. I mean, if we really look back at it, that is stupid. It's like taking a Bedouin in the desert who has to learn to survive. His son has to learn how to survive, how to function, how to work, how to make perhaps the most superb leather you ever saw, feed the animals, everything, right? And suddenly plunk him down in the middle of an urban center and say, cross that street. And when he can't cross, saying, inferior intelligence. Get one of the so-called white Anglo-Saxon middle class, if this myth exists, and I've never really met one, and plunk him down in Africa, in a little village in Kumasi, and expect him to survive, and everyone will be a foreigner but him. Everyone will be doing something wrong. He can't survive. He won't know how to strain his water. He won't know how to test his water. One of the things the Indians of Canada are always saying is, you're breeding out of us a survival. Now, I know we have to get in the 20th century.
But do we really? Do we really
Yeah.
have to get everybody to be this
No,
into
but
the 20th
I think what we've got to
century?
do is to really
Be
look at the 20th
technologically
century
perfect?
in different terms.
Yes.
You see, because when they can survive in many instances, and we want them to become different people. First of all, I want them to become different people because we want to move them off that land because we found this oil on that land, and the sooner we get them urbanized, the
Yes.
sooner we can claim that land and exploit it and make our million. Okay, but apart from all of that, we aren't necessarily replacing their values with things of value or worth. We aren't replacing an awareness of older people. One of the things that was marvelous about Africa and this was not just me, this was my husband, was that there were no such thing as illegitimate children. Children were wanted. They belonged to a family unit, a group. All right. There were no such thing as old people in old folks' homes that you went to visit for 2 hours on Sunday. There were functional people. People said, all right, you can have this extended family in rural areas and agricultural societies and primitive backward societies. There's a city in Nigeria, a city, that is the second largest city in Africa, Ibadan. No one ever tells you. They always say Cairo and then they go to Johannesburg. Ibadan is the second largest city in all of Africa, but it's a black city, so no one counts it. But it really is in population. It has been urban, for 200 or 300 years. There's the extended family there. There are no old folks' homes there. It's as commercial as anything ever was. All these things exist without the myths. And we want them to become urban and put their old people in homes. We want them to, consider children illegitimate or bastards or whatever you care to call them. When the children, didn't ask for this appel en. I'm reverting to French when I get excited. I'm a real product of Quebec. All of these values we want to take from them, and we may not replace them with things of equal value. It's like taking the queen from people, just to get rid of her as a symbol. The queen's a tremendous symbol for some people. Why take her away? Why replace her with what? Why must we take symbols away from people? Why must the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church or Christianity destroy superb carvings, only to replace them 3 centuries later with bad carvings of the Virgin Mary? Why should they take away all of these things which are great and functional and of meaning, leave a void for a long period, then suddenly replace them with a tinsel carbon? If you really go into history, if you really want to study, you watch all of these changes and you find that even the people who take over, and again the Catholic Church is an example, they have taken from a society which they choose to call primitive their symbols and replaced it soon after with other symbols because they decided symbols are important to people. They want to replace them with symbols they can control. Why take away from people, these values for values which we're rejecting? Why, when we know what pollution is doing to us in our cities, and yet we're telling the Indians, get off your reserves, get in the cities and work.
Yes.
And we're racing as fast as we can out to the country. We say, come in and be urbanized, and then not speaking to them in our school.
We're not racing as fast as we can to the country. Have you ever tried leaving Toronto on a Friday evening?
That's true. But it's, the gifts, there's a marvelous Elenise Obam-Sawam, who is an Abenaki Indian in Montreal. And she often speaks of the gifts that she would give. The Indians have gifts to give us, and we are not even holding out our hands for them. We don't want these gifts.
Do you think that we will move from using skin color, that we need something to react to when we first initially see a person? That, this is very poorly
understood. Let's try some intellectual levels. Why don't we try some intellectual levels?
That we use another trigger instead of skin color.
But do we have to measure? Do we have to live in such a competitive society that we have to measure?
No, not measure, but a great deal of initial reaction today between people, practically all over the world, is on the basis of skin color. The castes react to skin color.
Rid of, see, this is where it's so ridiculous.
The outside form.
All right, when you lose skin color, what are you going to judge with?
What do you think they should judge with? What do you hope they're going to judge with? Because I'm a pessimist.
I'm a woman.
I don't think it's going to change.
So when I see a man, my first reaction isn't necessarily his color. It's kind of, are there wavelengths going on? That happens everywhere, doesn't it? I mean, you're a man and a woman, and there's this kind of rapport established. If you're old or young, there are other kinds of rapports. There are all kinds of universal rapports established. There's the kind of in-group where you all of a sudden all know you're kind of involved in a great camp you put on. Like I'm involved in exhibition work and writing. And every one of us, when we move from expo to expo and we meet each other, we kind of know what's happening in communications. And we're sharing a great big joke. We're sharing a world or a great seriousness.
Where
This is
were
it.
you at?
And that's what you
Were
judge.
you in Japan?
Yeah, I was in Japan.
What were you doing there?
Well,
What
I
did
am.
you, what did you do exactly?
Well, this is, this is one of the, this is where it's all a myth. My job, believe it or not, was to tell
believe you.
the Orient, Japan, what Canada was like. I was telling, no, it's true, and I got paid for it, and I got paid well. My job was to tell Japan and everyone who came to Expo 70, which was the first big exhibition in the Orient, what Canada was. So I had to identify Canada at the time when we were going through crisis of identification. My job was to put down in black and white. So that's wrong. It wasn't in black
Don't
and
say
white.
black and white.
Yeah, boy, am I a product of Canadian school. The Panthers are going to go bang, 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 and I'm going to go down with the rest of them. No, but to do it audiovisual terms, in terms the Japanese could understand what it was to be a Canadian. And
When they could see you, this was on TV and film, and they could see you?
no, not me necessarily,
Oh.
because we did a pavilion called the
Or you were
Canadian
in charge
Pavilion.
of the channeling of the communications?
Yes, my job was theme development. I developed the word discovery. When we got to Japan, rather tell them what we were, and how was I going to tell them what a Canadian was? Was it an Ottawa Valley? Was it a Maritiner? Was it a BC? Was it kind of Ontario? So what we did was we involved the Japanese into discovering for themselves and making a kind of judgment when we exposed them to all these things that seemed to be Canadian, what a Canadian was. And it worked, because our pavilion, was a great success. It was a hilarious, beautiful pavilion. It had, these lovely mirrored sides that Arthur Erickson designed, which kind of disappeared. And again, this is discovery, because it's an elusive quality to be a Canadian. It's a quality of spirit. It changes, it moves, it's not rigid. And this is what we defined being a Canadian was, to be flexible. Maybe we were lying, maybe we were ahead of our time. But I put it to you that to be a Canadian may be sometimes dull mediating, but as long as you don't have to go to war, it's kind of live and let live, which is great. It's kind of a curiosity in finding a way of solving problems. And when we put all these together, we came up with what the Canadian Pavilion was at Expo 70. And obviously, whether the Canadians agree with me or not, all the guides loved it, and the Japanese seemed to have loved it, and it was the pavilion, I think it was a pavilion that had most people in it first. And the Japanese didn't really want to see Canada, they wanted to see Russia, and they wanted to see America. But what was marvelous about it is that when we got it done, I didn't have to be there, Everyone who went through kind of said, that's my country. And when Harvey Kirk went through, the newscaster, I remember it was opening day, and when he finished going through, he and I, and a girl named Sonia, and a man named Mr. Sheena, who was head of Sumitomo, who was a real VIP, were kind of standing together, and Harvey Kirk grabbed me and Sonia and started to cry, and we were terribly embarrassed because Sheena was very important Japanese, very proper, and we thought, has he been drinking? What's the matter? And he said to me, why am I crying? I'm crying because I'm such a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, I'm afraid to click my heels and jump up and say, I'm proud to be a Canadian. And he was so emotionally moved, he started to cry because he couldn't break through and say, this is wonderful. And Mr. Sheena was so marvelous because he said, I understand, to him. And we all walked out holding hands, into the courtyard. And I thought, now, I was a Canadian. I managed to capture with, not me, but a whole team of us, the spirit of Canada, and I was one of them. And, and it was great. It was just great. And I came back, and one incident happened to me when I came back, and I felt like saying, how can you, Sir George Williams incident, they were saying, go home, send the blacks home. And I thought, either I'm going to become schizophrenic, or they are. What do they mean we don't belong here when I just finished doing probably one of the most important PR jobs for the government? And successfully, and yet they turn around telling my people, go home where? This is home. So if they didn't feel at home with all of us here,
Who's
they were
they?
the alien. Well, the people who scream and yell and say, go home to black people. You know, go home. Where? Do they mean go back to where you originally came from? Well, that's possible, and you do go back to be fed, but they do too. But home is here where you make it, you know. And any Canadian who really believes that people have another place to go than here hasn't even read history, because the blacks in this continent have been here almost 300 years. And when the first blacks were brought to this continent, I think there was something like 1.5 million white people total in North America. So everyone who turns around and thinks blacks belong somewhere else better just open up any old history book. Any old history book. They were here before the Irish got here. With due respects to most of the Irish, except the regiments and people like that. You know, so it's
Talking of another elusive quality, this is a word that has become, in a way, a crutch, and in some ways a very powerful psychological defense for people. This word is soul.
soul.
What is soul?
How many angels can dance on the
Head of a pin.
Head of a pin. What is
Do you
soul?
think that you
We all
had
have it.
that group that you walked out with at
We
the
had-
expo had soul?
We had it, you know. We had it. Now, who was it? Sonia, who is German and French Canadian mixed, right? Sonia Finch. Mr. Shina-san, who was, you know, an old samurai from way back, a very proper Japanese. There was me. And there was Harvey Kirk. Now, this is a cross-section of the world, right? And we suddenly felt as one. You know, we suddenly felt because we were looking at that beautiful drawing, Knojuak's carving on the wall. It's an Eskimo. And it was so powerful. It was kind of this beautiful mythical bird up there on the wall, you know. And it had a wingspread of 17 feet, I think, 14 to 17 feet, and it was 56 feet high. You know, and it gave you goose flesh. It was so beautiful. That's the soul of Canada, right? And we felt it. We felt this whole thing. And when he finished kind of saying, why can't I? And we understood. And when this gentleman said, I understand, and, you know, we had to defer to him. We were a guest in his country. He was a host, and he represented to us the inscrutable Japanese. But he understood, you know. And when we walked out, all four of us holding hands, and, I mean, the age range was unbelievable. We were together. Now, if such a thing as that is soul, that's soul. I don't think soul is, I think everyone has soul. I think it's an individual thing. I think soul is killed by prejudice. I think when parents kind of grind their children into this kind of hate this, don't do this, watch that, be afraid of that, do this, climb all the way up there, they're getting rid of the breathing process, the regenerative process. You know, when they think the vertical mosaic kind of, if they don't read it and they don't watch, and if they aren't guided by some of the things that it points out very clearly there, but if they instead identify with a group and say, come hell or high water, we're going to move along this, they are killing soul. They are killing input. Soul, yes, black people, they say, have soul. Instead of Cadillacs. Well, they're supposed to have Cadillacs too. Instead of, they're supposed to have Lincolns. Well, whatever they're not supposed to have, they have soul instead. That's not true. We all have it, different ways, different degrees. I'm more exuberant than some people, less inhibited. You know, that's what shows. How do you know how inhibited I am in other areas? Everyone has soul. I don't want everyone to be as exuberant about things as I am. I need my husband's restraint. You know, I need him to kind of put his hand out and say, calm down, Mairuth. You know, he has soul. Again, I think we have to almost throw away the textbooks that we've been using. I think we have to really
I hear that
live
from every class
with
I
a
teach
nice,
every year.
fresh approach. We have to kind of react instantly. You know, they're going back to this whole business of touch. Men in India put their arms around each other in Africa. And all of a sudden, here in this world, if you touch each other, something's wrong. Suddenly
it's embarrassing,
right,
and
they're turning around.
invasion of privacy.
Right. And they're turning around and now saying, yes, touch each other, learn to touch each other. It costs a fortune to learn to touch each other. It's, the textbooks that teach us myths are obsolete. Burn them. That's a fascist. Do it.